Society presents its president, John F. McManus. In this program, Mr. McManus discusses a very serious problem, the betrayal of America's military to the United Nations. The subject of his book, Changing Commands.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin this relatively short program by thanking you for some of your time. We will be discussing a very serious problem facing our nation. Here's the situation in a nutshell. From the very inception of the United Nations in 1945, powerful forces within our country have been seeking to build the United Nations into a totalitarian world government. A major step toward that goal is the delivery of our military to the United Nations. The one-worlders are getting very close to their final objective. If they succeed in reaching it, the independence of this nation and the freedom of the American people will be swallowed up in a UN-controlled world government. Many Americans who love this country have been persuaded that the United Nations constitutes no threat whatsoever to their freedom. Huge numbers have even been led to believe that the World Organization is a bumbling bureaucracy that does little except talk. They are wrong. The United Nations and its promoters are actively working to gain control over education, children, the family, population matters, the environment, our military, and just about everything else. Anyone who wants to gain an insight into the totalitarian nature of the United Nations need only contrast the philosophical underpinnings of our nation with those of the United Nations as expressed in its International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Before we look at the UN document, let's recall the foundations of this nation. The United States, of course, began with the Declaration of Independence, which proclaims the self-evident truth that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Immediately after proclaiming that truth, the Declaration defines the role of government, where it says, to secure these rights, governments are instituted. The American system states that there is a God and that He, not government, grants us rights. The purpose of government is merely to protect those rights and nothing more. Consistent with these assertions, now forbidden in the government schools, the Bill of Rights pronounces very clearly that Congress shall make no law regarding fundamental God-given rights. Why is Congress forbidden to make law regarding these rights? Simply because the rights transcend any power of government which is subordinate. The rights were given by God, but no mention of God appears in the UN's documents, and so the UN would have everyone believe that rights are granted by government, from the UN, for instance. Article 18 of the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states the following: everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But nothing is stated about where the right came from. We are supposed to accept that the United Nations supplies rights. But what the United Nations supplies, it can also take away, which is what it immediately proposes 2 sentences later when it states in Article 18, freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law. The Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall make no law. What a difference. Article 21 of the UN Covenant reads as follows: the right of peaceful assembly shall be recognized. No restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law. The difference couldn't be more fundamental. It is worth noting that the UN's attitude about basic rights is exactly parallel to the view expressed in the Soviet Union's constitution during the days of Joseph Stalin. The UN's philosophy is essentially that of a tyrant. Americans should have nothing to do with this organization. During this program, I will focus mainly on the betrayal of the U.S. military to the United Nations. I've written this book to provide the details about what is happening to our armed forces. They are experiencing what amounts to changing commands, which is the title of my book. Some of this change in direction comes from American leaders who are committed to world government, not to their oath to support and defend the U.S. Constitution. And some of the missions being assigned our military are already coming from officials of other nations who wear the blue helmets and blue berets of the United Nations. In recent years, successive presidents have cited United Nations resolutions for their authority to send American forces into foreign nations, even place them under UN control. In doing so, they have completely thumbed their noses at the U.S. Constitution they have sworn to uphold. While a few voices of opposition have arisen in Congress because of these flagrant abuses of power, there have not been enough senators and congressmen to stop the continuing misuse of our military. The slide toward a complete loss of control over our armed forces continues. No one should ever forget that our government officials and our military personnel swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. In the few places where the military is discussed in the Constitution is very clear. It states that Congress has power to raise and support an army and a navy. No one questions that. Then the Constitution states that Congress and Congress alone has the power to declare war. But did Congress declare war in the Korean War? No. Did Congress declare war in the Vietnam War? No. Did Congress declare war in Desert Storm, the war against Iraq? Again, no. The military of this nation has become the president's own force to do with as he pleases. This assumption of power is terribly wrong and must be reversed. Finally, the Constitution states in Article 2, Section 2, the President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. This role now includes the Air Force and the Marine Corps. But the founders of this nation made clear that the Commander-in-Chief role was only a temporary assignment of responsibility, not a grant of power. In other words, the armed services of the United States do not belong to the President and cannot be used by him in whatever role he wishes. The purpose for which our nation maintains a military is to protect the lives and property of the people of this country. Period. We don't allow ourselves to be taxed to provide globo cops for the United Nations. If a president uses the military for any purpose other than protecting the lives and property of Americans, he is exceeding the powers of his office. He should be stopped by Congress, but the purpose for the military has been expanded to include an undefined vital interests of our nation, which leaves the door wide open for anything. History shows that war always leads to more government, and in our times, war is leading the people to clamor for world government. History also shows that unscrupulous leaders have forever been employing the military for purposes other than the protection of the people's life and property. And history is now being repeated in these days, as our own leaders are using the military and the fear of war to lead America into a sovereignty-destroying world government. Rather than just make such a statement, let's go over some recent events to show precisely what is happening. In 1990, President George Bush responded to Iraq's invasion of neighboring Kuwait by repeatedly telling our nation that he was committing U.S. troops to the Middle East to create a, quote, new world order, end quote. Every time he mentioned this phrase, he linked it to a reinvigorated or an enhanced United Nations. He made the overall goal of his action completely clear, a more powerful United Nations. After sending 200,000 troops to the Middle East in what he claimed was a defensive operation, Mr. Bush actually went to the United Nations in the fall of 1990 to obtain a resolution authorizing the use of U.S. forces to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. He didn't go to Congress for such authorization, and Congress didn't stop him when he cited the authority of the United Nations in place of Congress's clearly stated authority. Later, Congress even passed a resolution supporting the United Nations resolution. Once in possession of the UN's acquiescence of his plans to wage war, Mr. Bush converted the mission of our forces to offensive and beefed up their numbers to 500,000 troops under arms. In December 1990, a month before the war actually began, Mr. Bush was visited in the White House by 2 U.S. senators who pleaded with him not to start the war. They had just returned from Saudi Arabia, where they saw 500,000 Americans preparing for war. They wanted the president to avoid the bloodshed they expected would develop. They asked him to let the sanctions against Saddam Hussein's government run their course. They suggested that he negotiate further. They wanted anything but the terrible bloodletting that everyone had been led to believe would occur. Mr. Bush listened to the senators, Paul Simon and George Mitchell, and then he told them, if we use the military, we can make the United Nations a really meaningful, effective voice for peace. Ladies and gentlemen, consider what the President of the United States said. If we use the military, he stated, we can build the United Nations. That was his goal in the war against Iraq, and it is a complete misuse of the military, a violation of the Constitution, an enormous usurpation of power by the President, and a very serious threat to the independence of our nation and all nations. Mr. Bush then launched the war on January 17, 1991. The pro-UN and pro-World Government Council on Foreign Relations approvingly claimed in its publication Foreign Affairs that these actions taken by Mr. Bush were unprecedented. And indeed, they were unprecedented. But the precedents they established would later be used to justify additional misuse of our nation's military on behalf of the United Nations. Mr. Bush's UN-authorized war against Iraq did build the power of the United Nations. Then, in September 1991, he delivered a speech at UN headquarters in New York City. In that speech, entitled Pax Universalis, Universal Peace, he placed the United States on record in favor of UN military action to interfere in matters which were entirely within the borders of any nation, even change the leader of a nation. The UN Charter itself states that the organization has no power to intervene in domestic affairs. It states in Article 2, Paragraph 7, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Had this prohibition not been included in the charter, our nation would never have joined the UN in 1945, nor would most other nations have joined. Following Mr. Bush's UN speech, UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali issued his Agenda for Peace in June of 1992. In it, he stated that the time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty of nations has passed. This is a direct attack on national sovereignty of all nations. Boutros Ghali then called for UN military intervention within the borders of nations for a long list of new concerns. According to the Boutros Ghali plan, the UN would now target ecological damage, disruption of family life, unchecked population growth, drug usage, famine, disparity between rich and poor, virtually anything, anywhere, including within the borders of any nation. He, too, cares little about the UN Charter in his quest to enhance the power of the United Nations he serves. In September 1992, President Bush again appeared at UN headquarters, where he saluted the Secretary General's call for the vast expansion of UN operations, and he added humanitarian concerns to the list of new areas where he wanted the UN to be involved. Then in December 1992, in one of his final acts as president, Mr. Bush sent 30,000 U.S. troops into Somalia in what he claimed was a humanitarian mission. Again, he cited a UN resolution for his authority, and again, it was he who asked the UN to supply it. Only months later, the UN mission with our troops was converted into a military operation whose assignment was to disarm the civilian population and change the nation's leader. Congress meekly went along with this additional misuse of our nation's military. When Americans died in the subsequent action in Somalia, President Clinton, now in office, removed some of the American forces from the region, but then placed 4,000 troops under a UN command headed by a Turkish general. This was the first time U.S. combat forces were made to serve in a UN command under anyone but an American. But placing U.S. combat troops under a foreign commander in a UN operation wasn't the only precedent established in Somalia. The UN was now intervening in matters which were solely within the borders of an independent nation. Here were U.S. forces assigned by UN commanders the joint task of disarming the civilian population and changing the nation's leader. These precedents would be acted upon later. Now that they are in place and haven't been challenged, they could be cited for use against any nation, including our own. Then, in September 1994, President Clinton sent tens of thousands of U.S. troops into Haiti to enforce another UN resolution. Their assignment? Disarm the civilian population and change the nation's leader. Asked at a news conference what authority he was relying on to use our armed forces in such a venture, President Clinton responded, "I would welcome the support of Congress, and I hope that I will have that. But like my predecessors of both parties, I have not agreed that I was constitutionally mandated to get it." The Constitution was dealt another body blow in that instance. Was Mr. Clinton correct in citing predecessors of both parties for what he had done? Yes, indeed. President Truman in the Korean War, Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon in the Vietnam War, and President Bush in the war against Iraq. Congress's loss of control over the war-making power hasn't been the work of any particular political party. Both of the major parties are guilty, and Congress, too, is guilty for allowing it to happen. In July 1945, when the U.S. Senate was debating the matter of our nation's entry into the United Nations, Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana stated, "If we enter into this treaty, we take power away from the Congress, and the President can send troops all over the world to fight battles everywhere." Senator Wheeler was correct, but the Senate still voted to approve the UN Charter, and our nation became a UN member. In December 1945, Congress approved the UN Participation Act, designed to arm the President with power to commit troops to UN duty. Several senators tried to amend the act to require congressional approval each time troops were to be sent to a UN mission. Their amendment was overwhelmingly defeated. Then in 1949, the Senate debated our nation's entry into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO is a regional arrangement formed under the umbrella of the United Nations. Several senators pointed out that the NATO agreement required us to supply arms to other nations and to go to war if any of the 12 nations in the pact were attacked. They wanted the treaty to state that the U.S. was not required to arm other nations, but they were overwhelmed by other senators who wanted us deeply involved in the UN-sponsored NATO agreement. Ohio Senator Robert Taft took the occasion of the NATO debate to criticize the Truman administration, saying with great foresight that it had adopted a tendency to interfere in the affairs of other nations, to assume that we are a kind of a demigod or Santa Claus to solve the problems of the world, and that attitude is more and more likely to involve us in disputes where our liberty is not in fact concerned. But U.S. entry into NATO was approved, and we began to send troops to Europe. In 1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea. Responding to a UN resolution, President Truman sent troops to Korea. Several senators immediately pointed out that the President had gotten us into a war without a declaration of war by Congress, as called for by the Constitution. Senator Taft called the Truman action, quote, "a complete usurpation by the President of the authority to use the armed forces of this nation," close quote. He was completely correct. He added, "If the President can intervene in Korea without congressional approval, he can go to war in Malaya, or Indonesia, or Iran, or South America." And the senator could have added, or Vietnam, except that this was 1950, and the nation known as Vietnam didn't yet exist. During the Korean War, our forces under General MacArthur initially won the war until the Chinese Communist forces entered the fray and carried the struggle on for 2 more years. Many restrictions on our own troops denied them the final victory, and MacArthur was eventually fired for protesting the way he was forced to fight. In his own book, Reminiscences, General MacArthur pointed out that the Chinese general Lin Piao later circulated a leaflet in China which stated, "I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur." Who assured the communist Chinese leader that MacArthur would be restrained? At the time, the Undersecretary for Political and Security Council Affairs at the United Nations, the chief military official of the world body, was a Soviet communist. and a succession of communists named by the Soviet Union held that post for more than 40 years. This incredible arrangement was secretly agreed to by the U.S. delegation at the founding of the United Nations. And so everything our forces were doing was being reported to a Soviet communist at the UN, who, of course, was an ally of the North Korean communists. Who restrained General MacArthur? Our own leaders. But who assured the Chinese general that MacArthur would be restrained? The Soviet communist at the UN. None of these individuals cared about U.S. troops or U.S. independence. They were working to achieve world government, and they were helped toward that goal by people from our own state and defense departments. Next came Vietnam, where our forces were under the umbrella of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, a sister organization to NATO. They were told to fight, but not to win, shoot, but not until they were shot at, refrain from pursuing the enemy across the borders, and keep from harming his major installations. And all during the war, our government supplied the communist governments in Europe who were supplying North Vietnam with the wherewithal to kill Americans. The betrayal was immense. All of it pushed our nation's military ever more deeply into the grasp of the United Nations. There is even a more comprehensive betrayal we must discuss. Back in 1961, President John Kennedy went to the United Nations, where he presented this document, the U.S. Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. A three-stage program, it calls for eventually turning over the U.S. military to the world body, and it is continually unfolding. The plan has been acknowledged by numerous senior government personnel to be the official program of the United States. This disarmament scheme ends by stating, progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Note the use of the term peace force, which is a contradiction. If peace has to be forced, it's not peace. Made up of troops from various nations, this UN peace force would certainly include members of our own military. This means that all nations would disarm, but the United Nations would not. Therefore, its very name is a lie. It doesn't call for general and complete disarmament. It calls for selective disarmament. This program also requires that nations retain only those forces, non-nuclear armaments, and establishments required for the purpose of maintaining internal order. This amounts to the establishment of a central police force, the hallmark of any tyranny. It further states, the manufacture of armaments would be prohibited except for those of agreed types and quantities to be used by the UN peace force. This is disarmament of the people in addition to disarmament of governments. It can't be stressed too strongly that this program is the fixed, determined, and approved policy of the government of the United States. If it is allowed to proceed to its final stage, the UN will be unchallengeable. World government will establish its brand of world peace, and anyone who disagrees will be dealt with by those who possess all the guns. This entire program, put together by the U.S. State Department and transmitted to the United Nations in 1961 by President Kennedy, appears in its entirety as an appendix in my book. Anyone familiar with the John Birch Society's continuing efforts to alert Americans to the drive to destroy freedom and lead our nation into a UN-controlled, one-world government knows that our society focuses attention on the Council on Foreign Relations. This New York-based private organization has labored for 7 decades to compromise U.S. sovereignty and create a single world government. There were 43 of its members involved in the planning for and actual creation of the UN in 1945. Most of the individuals we have named in this program are or have been CFR members. Currently, President Clinton and most of his cabinet officials hold CFR membership. So do many members of Congress, top officials of the mass media, many heads of foundations, even top generals and admirals. Yes, top military officers hold membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. As is shown in this book, 4 of the past 5 Army Chiefs of Staff have been members of the CFR. Also, the CFR can claim as members the last 7 Air Force Chiefs of Staff and several of the recent Commandants of the Marine Corps and Chiefs of Naval Operations. General Colin Powell and several of his predecessors as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been members of the Council on Foreign Relations. What is happening is that our military at the top is being programmed to think of world government and globalism instead of in terms of national independence and the Constitution of the United States. There is a dramatic incident that shows this horrifying trend. In May 1994, over 200 Marine Corps enlisted men at the 29 Palms base in California were ordered to participate in a survey conducted by a Navy lieutenant commander. The men were given 46 questions, the last 7 of which sought their opinion about being assigned to, serving under, or being part of the United Nations. They were asked to indicate agreement or disagreement or no opinion after each question. One question asked their opinion about this statement. I would swear to the following code. I am a United Nations fighting person. I serve in the forces which maintain world peace and every nation's way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. The Marines were asked to indicate agreement, disagreement, or no opinion. The final question presented the following scenario and asked for their agreement, disagreement, or lack of opinion. The U.S. government declares a ban on the possession, sale, transportation, and transfer of all non-sporting firearms. A 30-day amnesty period is permitted for these firearms to be turned over to local authorities. At the end of this period, a number of citizen groups refuse to turn over their firearms. Consider the following statement. I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse or resist confiscation of firearms banned by the U.S. government. Do you agree or disagree or have no opinion? When our organization made the contents of this survey public, the Navy and Marine Corps quickly insisted that it was merely the work of a Navy officer who was doing a paper for graduate school. Even if that statement is true, a more important issue is that the senior Marine Corps officers allowed the survey to be conducted. Another important issue is that this survey is completely consistent with the way policy is being altered at the top echelons of both the U.S. military and the U.S. government. No Marine who values the U.S. Constitution and national independence should sanction the presentation of such attitudes being given to the men under his command. But the senior officers at the 29 Palms base, according to the base newspaper, had also just welcomed and shown around the base a group from the Council on Foreign Relations. The fact that at the time the Commandant of the Marine Corps was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations is highly significant. We are reliably informed by one of the Marines forced to take this survey that the enlisted Marines who participated were outraged. But the senior officers were not only not outraged, they permitted it. The military is being changed at the top. And unless there is a great awakening amongst the American people to put a stop to this, the directives to the personnel in the Marine Corps and in all the branches of the armed services will soon be coming from the United Nations or from individuals who are pro-United Nations. This is the subject of changing commands, which we hope many Americans who value liberty will want to read and share with others. America must never be swallowed up in a godless world government under the United Nations. The freedoms we enjoy must be preserved and passed on to the children of today and tomorrow. The John Birch Society has the program and the understanding about what to do and how to keep our nation free. If you value personal freedom and national independence, please join with us. Let the cry be, get us out of the United Nations. Our nation, the greatest experiment in human liberty in all history, can be preserved. But it's up to you to do so, because the time to save our nation is running out.